شو اسمك عمو؟ انت وين ابوك؟ وين؟ وين مات؟ شنو متريقة متغدية متعشية؟
يطلق علينا عفوا.
Welcome to this special edition of the show. Today we're going to run the entire interview I did with Tim Norman, who is one of the world's premier experts on the Skripal hoax. I went to see him in late December in his home in Brighton, and he'd just been to Salisbury, where the psyops or the hoax took place. Cast your minds back to 2018, to Russian agents from the GRU turned up and allegedly smeared the most toxic substance known to man, Novichok, Russian manufactured, onto a doorknob in the quiet close of Salisbury, this English suburban historic town where the spy Sergei Skripal was living, having been exchanged in a spy swap for some agents a few years before. He'd been working secretly for the British, been jailed in Russia and caught, and now been exchanged in a spy swap and was living out his retirement in the UK in this quiet town. Now his daughter Yulia was visiting him, and they both succumbed apparently to this poison on a park bench on early March 2018, and it became an enormous cause. Putin was bringing chemical warfare, endangering millions of people in the UK, to the streets of Britain, and it came just as Russia was about to host the World Cup. So that sense of being hosted by a mass murderer suffused all coverage of that for the Russians coming out event. And of course, well, I won't say of course, but it also came in the wake of the exoneration of Donald Trump by the Mueller inquiry that he was not an agent of the Russians, but it gave new life to the Russia bad, America Trump bad, because he was talking to the Russian story. Because in the summer of 2018, Trump met with Putin in Helsinki. His exoneration by the Mueller inquiry gave him the political space to do that, but it was tamped down again by this revelation by the British that a spy had and his young 33-year-old daughter had been poisoned with the most toxic substance known to man. So that's a reminder of what actually happened. That's the official story. Dozens of diplomats were expelled in the UK and throughout Europe, and added to a series of other scandals, if you like, from the 2010s, all painted Russia and Putin in an extremely negative light. He was supposed to have conducted gas attacks, chemical weapons attacks in Syria in the 2010s. There was the Litvinenko in 2006 and so on. But the Skripals disappeared. They didn't die. They went to hospital, and Yulia phoned her cousin, I think, in Moscow. And she said, everything's all right. I'm all right. But she wasn't allowed to appear in public. She appeared in public, I think, in May 2000, 2 months after the event, in a carefully scripted event in a RAF base where she didn't answer questions, but she read out a statement and said something. She obviously lost weight. She had been unconscious, and her father, then 66, was never seen again after the poisoning and has never been seen. They're supposed to be still alive, but the Russian consulate has never been given access to them. A few months later, Novichok was the Russian spies were supposed to have left a sort of perfume bottle with the remaining Novichok that hadn't poisoned these two in a rubbish bin, and then this would have been supposed to have been picked up by a guy called Charlie Rowley, who was a sort of a drunk alcoholic bin diver type, and then he gave it to his poor suffering girlfriend. and she was supposed to have smeared it on herself or would have sprayed herself as she died, but he didn't. He also smeared himself. And one of the most, uh, I would say, biggest experts on this topic was a guy called Tim Norman, who works for the Brighton Argus, very well respected regional newspaper. I think he's a production editor or something. And he's very, very knowledgeable, very wise, very sort of low key. And he was in Salisbury during with Craig Murray, who's a very famous blogger in Britain, and a guy called Patrick Henningsen, who I was a colleague with when I was on a program called TNT, and they had like a public event, if you like, where people turned up. Dozens of people turned up and asked questions, and for Salisbury citizens to get the real story. And I missed out on that event, but I did catch up with him, Tim, sometime later, and that's what you'll see now. I'll give the unexpurgated interview. I guess people who are watching this kind of know what's going on anyway, so even though you could chop it up and turn it into more slick narrative, I think it'll I just run it from beginning to end.
Police have released new images of the man they believe poisoned the former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal. The CCTV video shows the two suspects, known by the false names Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov, in Salisbury on the day the Skripals were poisoned with a deadly nerve agent. Both Skripal and his daughter survived the incident. The UK accuses Russia of being behind the attack.
Well, I mean, the first thing to be said is clearly there were two Russians in Salisbury. I mean, whether or not they were there on a mission to kill Skripal is the actual question. And the alternative possibility that I would ask people to entertain is that they weren't there to kill Skripal. They were in fact there perhaps to meet Skripal for some reason. Exactly what reason is open to debate. We don't really know why they were there. But I would suggest that British intelligence knew they were heading to Salisbury, and from that point onwards they were effectively set up in some way and made to look like they were poisoners. They certainly did give a very uncomfortable interview on RT 6 months later, which has really become the sort of the focus, if you like, of the average British response to the suggestion that these two men weren't there on a mission to kill Skripal. So you think they were there to see the 123-metre spire, the Salisbury Cathedral spire, do you? Because that's what they said in this very uncomfortable interview they gave. So that's a sarcastic response you get, if you like, from the man on the street, so to speak, in Britain to the suggestion that they might not have been assassins. But nevertheless, I would ask anybody sceptical of this story to consider, would secret agents who failed to carry out assassination mission, I mean, let's make it clear, Sergei Skripal was not killed despite being exposed to this, allegedly exposed to this nerve agent, which is apparently far more deadly even than VX, which is almost impossibly lethal chemical. Would secret agents really go on their own national state broadcaster 6 months later without having thought up a cover story in the 6 months, or for that matter asked the interviewer ahead of time what kind of questions they might be asked? To avoid this debacle, I would suggest they wouldn't go on television in the first place. However, to get to the Dawn Sturgis issue, although Sergei Skripal didn't die after touching this nerve agent, and indeed neither did his daughter die, indeed nobody died in Salisbury on the day of this poisoning, and they of course supposedly spread poison all around Salisbury to the pubs we mentioned and to the restaurant. None of the people came into contact with this. Nobody died. No wildlife died. There's a strange story where they fed ducks, and these ducks didn't die, although Donald Trump was told that ducks did die, and that led to him expelling diplomats because he was emotionally affected by this idea. But leaving that to one side, 4 months later, a woman did die in a town called Amesbury, about 8 miles from Salisbury, and this death was then associated by the British with the Skripal event 4 months previously. And they did this by suggesting that the bottle that the two Russian alleged assassins used to contaminate the door handles of Skripal's home had been discarded in Salisbury, where it was discarded and for how long and at what point and when it was discovered, all these things are not clear. But allegedly it was discarded, and allegedly it was discovered by a man called Charles Rowley, as I say, 4 months after the event, after the Skripal event, and given to his girlfriend, who was called Dawn Sturgis. And she, allegedly, this is all according to the British account, in fact, purely according to his account, purely according to Charlie Rowley's account, we have to be very clear about this. He's the sole witness to this part of the narrative. She apparently sprayed herself somehow with this liquid from this bottle, and within 15 minutes apparently suffered very severe poisoning effects, and indeed effectively died before the paramedics were able to attend Charlie Rowley's flat in Amesbury. And she was then taken to hospital, but she was effectively brain dead on arrival, and her life support was turned off 8 days later. But as I say, it's very important to remember that that whole narrative of a bottle being found and then Dawn being given the bottle and then using it to apply poison to her skin and then her dying, all that narrative belongs entirely to Charlie Rowley, her boyfriend. Now, her boyfriend is an exceptionally unreliable witness. He was an alcoholic, he was a heroin addict, he was a convicted petty criminal and a convicted fraudster, and his previous girlfriend 2 years before had died of a heroin overdose in his presence, in his flat, while he didn't take sufficient precaution, he didn't call the ambulance and so forth. And so she had died. So it's, if you like, the second time that his girlfriend had died in his flat, in his presence. And he did not appear before the inquiry into Dawn's death, which followed. The Sturgis family put pressure on the British government to investigate the causes of Dawn's death. And when they finally, 6 years later, it took 6 years before the British government actually got to the point where it held a public inquiry, they did not call this key witness, Charlie Rowley, to give oral evidence of any kind because they claimed he was too drunk. I mean, that is in the final report. He was too drunk to give evidence. The key witness. And I mean, I may add that the other two key witnesses who didn't give evidence to the Dawn Sturgis inquiry were, of course, the Skripals themselves. They were also not called to give oral evidence, even by secure video link, or even in private sessions which were held behind closed doors, because of course the irony with British public inquiries is they can hold sessions in secret. They're not public at all in that sense. They in fact are secret, or they can be partly secret.
So, and yet the inquiry concluded that, well, I just saw the headlines, I didn't bother to read. I mean, it was as recently as the first week in December that they said that Putin was morally responsible for Dawn Sturgis's death. I mean, let's say if this was a psychological operation by the British intelligence, it was a way to at least get someone killed, and then Putin would have sort of get blamed for that. Do you think, well, I don't know, basically, I mean, there seems to be a lot of anomalies because, these guys, even if suppose they were assassins, they had made toxic material known to man, and they walked it and they spread it on a doorknob without having any protective equipment because they're only wearing small backpacks, couldn't fit protective equipment. Then they rewrapped these perfume bottle or resealed it using one of those cheap resealers you could buy on Amazon. Put it in a rubbish bin where it's lay for 4 months without being picked up by the bin man, and then it was picked up by Charlie Rowley, and then he didn't die, but she did die. Do we even know that whether Rowley was making everything up, or do you think he was a plant? I mean, do you think he was working for maybe the intelligence services?
It's a very curious detail about this plastic that you refer to, the wrapping of the plastic and so forth, because although it's quite clear, and he's quite clear about it, that he has no memory of finding the bottle. And in fact, when you look at the transcripts of his interviews with the police from 6 years before, as the inquiry did, because it didn't interview him in person, you can see it's really he is a suggestible person. He's a vulnerable person in many ways, and it is suggested to him that he found the bottle, but he can't remember where he found it. He suggests all kinds of places and times that he could have found it, perhaps shortly before he gave it to Dawn, or perhaps, shortly before the two Russians allegedly dumped it 4 months previously, and so forth. But he is extremely clear in an interview that he gives shortly after he's discharged from hospital, because he was supposedly exposed. Once again, he survived. So much for the most deadly nerve agent known to man. He was absolutely emphatic that the bottle was wrapped in plastic, was boxed. It was in 2 pieces. inside the box, and the box was wrapped in thick plastic. And so this creates, if you like, a narrative difficulty for the inquiry. How could this bottle have been wrapped in plastic? How could the bottle have turned up in Charlie Rowley's possession when he's so emphatic that it was wrapped in plastic? And so it's because of that they developed this rather improbable hypothesis that the two Russians, for some absolutely unknown reason, having used the bottle to contaminate Sergei Skripal's front door handle, went to a public toilet in Salisbury, took apart their bottle, exposing themselves to almost fantastic risk. If this was the case, they could have killed themselves in this public toilet by doing this bizarre manoeuvre. But nevertheless, this is a theory seriously advanced by the Dawn Sturgis inquiry, by the lead counsel, Andrew O'Connor, actually advances his theory to the police as part of his questioning. Could the two men have gone to a public toilet, taken apart their bottle, sealed it up using a portable heat sealer, and then dumped it in a bin in Salisbury without ever anybody asking them why would they take this extraordinarily dangerous and bizarre and unnecessary step? And they could have just put it in a bin or put it in a plastic bag in a bin if they were concerned about wrapping it up. It makes absolutely no sense unless you see it as being a way of, if you like, reverse engineering the narrative after the event to try and make it fit Charlie Rowley's testimony about the bottle being wrapped in plastic. As far as being a plant is concerned, I don't know if he was a plant as such. I think the bottle was actually planted, that's for sure, because the first time we actually see the bottle, for certain, is in his flat. And it's seen after 10 days of searching. The police seal off his flat eventually and then search it for drugs paraphernalia. They're specifically looking for small bottles and vials and things of that nature. It's more or less a fingertip search. They describe in the inquiry documents how thorough the search is, and yet it takes them 10 days before they find this bottle simply sitting on the kitchen work surface among the washing up and next to an empty glass of beer. So this very strongly, to my mind, suggests that the bottle was placed there later, while Charlie Rowley was in hospital, and indeed after Dawn Sturgis herself had died because her life support system had been turned off at that point.
So I know that it's not our job or your job to construct an alternative scenario. I mean, it said all you have to do is point out the anomalies that refute that. I mean, I always take this as an example that Pluto wasn't discovered until 1930, but they knew that from 1846 onwards that there had to be another planet because of the perturbations of the orbit of Neptune. So you are allowed to ask questions and say that the official theory can't be true. But do you think? I mean, what was Rowley poisoned by then, and what did Dawn Sturgis die of if it wasn't some kind of poison?
Well, there was an autopsy on Dawn's body, of course, and there was a pathologist. He was called Professor Guy Rutty. He's an extremely eminent pathologist. And one of the many anomalies to do with Dawn Sturgis's autopsy is that Professor Rutty wasn't given the levels of drugs that was found in her system. So he was told which drugs were found in her system, but he wasn't told, as it were, the concentrations or the quantitative information about the drugs that were in Dawn's system. So the drugs that were found in Dawn's system included cocaine, the metabolites of cocaine, sedatives and antidepressants in rather high levels. He was told the levels of the antidepressants and the sedatives, which in themselves, in combination with alcohol, and Dawn was sadly an alcoholic, there's no question about that, in themselves, sedatives and antidepressants and alcohol represented a significant risk of death, taken on their own. So there's that. But also fentanyl, which is a powerful synthetic opiate, was also found in her blood. And fentanyl, if you like, has a dual use. It does have medical applications. It's used as a painkiller in medical situations. But it's extremely unusual, not to say against the rules, shall we say, to give somebody who's been admitted to hospital suffering from a suspected opiate overdose, which is the case in Dawn's case, further, if you like, opiate-based painkillers, given that she's already believed to have taken an overdose of opiates. Furthermore, Dawn, as I mentioned, was suffering from catastrophic brain damage. She really didn't actually need painkillers. Nevertheless, the hospital claimed that it gave Dawn fentanyl after her admission to hospital. And in doing so, we lose, as it were, any chance to know if she had taken fentanyl before or after admission in hospital. If you like, that whole question of fentanyl becomes camouflaged because the hospital says she was given fentanyl. So out of those things, nevertheless, you can see a significant risk to Dawn's life simply from the alcohol, antidepressants and sedatives, leaving aside the question of fentanyl. And even more interesting than that is that these samples, blood and urine samples from Dawn, were sent to an NHS laboratory in Birmingham, which specialises in its extremely sensitive processes. Thousands of drugs can be detected in people's samples. And they look for all manner of chemicals and illicit drugs of abuse and so forth in these samples. They did not find evidence of organophosphate poisoning in her blood. Now, organophosphates run from pesticides, which are relatively benign, so to speak, dangerous, to weaponised nerve agents such as sarin, Soman, VX, and apparently Novichok. So it's very interesting that this drug screening laboratory in Birmingham could not find evidence of organophosphate poisoning in Dawn's blood. So you have to draw your own conclusions from that. She did have fentanyl in her blood. She did not have evidence of organophosphate poisoning in her blood. And the suggestion that she did have Novichok in her blood was supplied later by Porton Down, the SDL Porton Down, that also took samples from Dawn at the same time. They were sent to the laboratory in Birmingham, and separately they claimed to have identified the markers of Novichok, so-called Novichok, in her blood. So
the difference is that Porton Down is very close to the intelligence services and was probably in on the original psychological operation, whereas an NHS laboratory wouldn't have been, and they're more likely to tell the truth.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, Porton Down in the documents anticipates that Birmingham would not find evidence. They say in the documents quite clearly, expecting Birmingham not to find evidence of organophosphates in Dawn's samples. We asked for samples of our own from her to take to our own laboratories and test there. And it's often said, going back to these sort of cynical remarks, you think that the Russians had travelled thousands of miles just to look at the 123-metre spire, do you, at the same time as this former Russian spy collapses in Salisbury? Oh, what a strange coincidence, the sort of sarcastic response. Well, you might turn that on its head and say, what a strange coincidence that this Novichok chemical weapon apparently appeared in Salisbury when Porton Down is barely 8 miles up the road from Salisbury. What a coincidence that is.
Well, or the fact that there was an operation called Toxic Dagger, which is exactly about simulating an attack on a British city. So can you tell them, what do you know about that?
That's correct. I mean, but this is something that commonly happens in, shall we say, controversial events of this nature. It's not the first time that something, if you like, some sort of event, for example, the 7/7 bombings at the same time, the London Underground bombings, at the same time as they occurred, there was a terror exercise happening on the Underground at the same time. This seems to be a similar, and indeed on 9/11, there were exercises happening at the same time as the attacks on the Twin Towers. So this is, if you like, an echo of those kind of events. There had been an exercise, you say, called Toxic Dagger, involving a large number of military personnel and people from Porton Down, simulating a chemical weapons attack on Salisbury Plain just in the 2 weeks prior to this Skripal event.
So it's almost like the British want to kill two birds with one stone. One is to give their staff some training in the event of an actual attack, and the second is to cause huge embarrassment to the Russians.
There's definitely an element of opportunism to it. I mean, whether or not they planned it, my impression is that these two Russians, as I suggested, were not coming to Salisbury to kill Skripal, but possibly to meet him for some reason. And if the British were aware of this possibility, they seized, as it were, the opportunity to not only prevent this meeting from taking place or whatever exchange of information, possibly even exfiltration is a possibility. They wanted to bring Skripal from Salisbury, and saw the opportunity then to also, as it were, turn it onto the Russian side, make it into a propaganda weapon, if you like, and suggest that the cause of Sergei Skripal's collapse and later disappearance was this Novichok nerve weapon. But we're left with the extraordinary cognitive dissonance of the fact that apparently, according to the British side, a terribly deadly military grade, another phrase we heard quite a lot from Theresa May at the time, military grade nerve agent was used in Salisbury, and yet absolutely nobody died until, well, 4 months later, allegedly, Dawn Sturgis was killed.
There was a letter in the Times from Stephen Davis, who was a consultant. He said, just for the information, 3 people were taken in, but none of them had nerve agents or organophosphate poisoning. And then he was quietened down. So there was a little bit of a revelation there to show that the Salisbury Hospital was not in on it quite. But I mean, Skripal, what interest would he have? I mean, you could see, apparently, I've read somewhere that he was missing his family. I think his wife had died, hadn't she? And so Yulia was his only family left, and she was obviously rooted in Moscow. So he might have wanted to go back. But was there a political reason that his redefection would be a threat to the British?
Well, actually, his mother was still alive in Moscow at the time as well.
Okay, right. Yeah.
Yes, in fact, she died subsequently, and the fact that the family in Russia heard nothing from Skripal, who by this time had disappeared, or been disappeared, if you will, by the British intelligence service, on the occasion of his mother's death is a very dark sign indeed, in fact. But yes, there's no question he was homesick. Yulia had remained with him in Salisbury for a few years after the death of her mother, and indeed Skripal's son had died as well. So he certainly would have wanted to go back to Moscow, I'm sure. In fact, there's suggestions that he didn't want to be part of the spy swap that brought him to Salisbury in the first place. He would have preferred to have stayed in Russia and served out his jail time for selling secrets, and so that he could live out his retirement and in Moscow with his family. However, there is a suggestion that while he was living in Salisbury, he was doing, if you like, a bit of work on the side for the British intelligence. He hadn't actually completely retired. And his handler was a gentleman called Pablo Miller, as an MI6 agent. And Pablo Miller was associated with Christopher Steele in a company called Orbis Business Intelligence. So Orbis Business Intelligence was employed by the Democrat campaign, indeed paid by the Hillary Clinton campaign, in the run-up to the 2016 election campaign when she was contesting the presidential elections with Donald Trump. And so Christopher Steele produced a dossier, the so-called dirty dossier, a rather salacious dossier of frankly fake information. I think it's fairly been conclusive that it was a largely concocted dossier of lies about Donald Trump in various compromising positions. And it seems that Pablo Miller would have obviously been being involved with Orbis Business Intelligence, with Christopher Steele, would have been involved in preparing this dossier of alleged dirt on President Trump. And so it seems very likely, and in fact this was reported in the Telegraph very early on, that Skripal's associate, Pablo Miller, was working with Christopher Steele on the Trump dossier, and very likely from that Skripal would have been brought in to make this dossier seem, if you like, have a patina of authentic Russian intelligence to it, which he would have been able to provide. So with that in mind, you then, as it were, to people's shock, as it was, Donald Trump won the election. And we had this Russiagate hysteria that built up after the election of Donald Trump, effectively to undermine his legitimacy and to suggest that none of it was genuine. And in fact, he was an agent of Putin and so forth. Very dangerous propaganda, if you ask me. But Skripal would find himself sitting on, if you like, a sort of ticking time bomb almost of secrets at that point, that he had been involved in preparing this fake dossier, very, very sensitive information, which perhaps he could use to bargain to return to Russia, or perhaps sell. After all, he was a sort of mercenary kind of person, had previously sold his secrets, but I would suggest he was very keen to go back to Russia and perhaps would have looked to trade that information.
Well, it seems to me, I mean, what we've got is Trump, the whole Russiagate thing, which was incidentally started by the British already in 2015, or the British together with Estonian and East European intelligence agencies, and then linked to the CIA. And it dominated the news cycle for 2 years. I remember it well, and every headline was linked, and you had all these Time magazine covers with a picture of the Kremlin of the St. Basil's Cathedral superimposed on the White House, and pictures of Putin, 100 different, really, what's the word? I mean, Putin as a demon, Putin with a nuclear mushroom cloud in his eyes, basically, I mean, really relentless non-stop propaganda, and Trump as he had a Kremlin stamped on his forehead of the Russian hammer and sickle, which was actually Soviet, but never mind. I mean, historians will know this is as bad as, let's say, the anti-Semitic propaganda in the 1930s. You know, it'll signify a whole era of intellectual corruption. 2017, 2018, relations got a little bit better. He was cleared sort of by the Mueller inquiry. And then he was going to go and see Putin in Helsinki in the summer of 2018. And what better way for Putin to explain this is actually what happened. And here's the evidence to prove it. I got Skripal's telling the whole story that leads back to the British. And the British had to take action before that happened.
That's certainly a possibility. I mean, there's evidence that when the formula from Novichok, as we mentioned, was published first in a book in 2008, and there's a suggestion that Hillary Clinton wanted to hold it in reserve, if you like, as a propaganda weapon to be brought out at some point in the future. She didn't want it mentioned. There's a suggestion she wanted, in her memos, she wanted mention of Novichok suppressed early on, and it would be used later as a propaganda instrument when the time was right. So perhaps the time was right, although I might suggest that, if you like, British intelligence pulled the trigger on the Novichok propaganda weapon a little, shall we say, haphazardly or prematurely, possibly in a rather slapdash way, because the whole Salisbury narrative bears, to my mind, the hallmarks of a rather poorly thought through, rather rushed operation. Indeed, no matter which way you look at it, if you choose to believe that it genuinely was an operation by Putin's men to try and poison Skripal by poisoning his front door, then that is it was a botched job. It didn't work. Skripal wasn't killed. It was a rather improbable operation in the first place. So it seems a mess and a botched job. But if you take the view it wasn't that, the other point of view that it was an attempt by, shall we say, British intelligence to stop Skripal from being exfiltrated or passing on information to these two men, once again, you get the impression it was very rushed. He was just quickly somehow incapacitated on a bench to stop him from talking. The whole thing did feel very hurried. And just to the point about the Russiagate hysteria that you mentioned, the way it had been going on for 2 years, the question that I always had in my mind was exactly how was Putin supposed to be puppeteering Trump, if you like, and what was the channel of communication by which he was supposed to be directing Trump's actions. I often imagined like the red telephone in the original Batman, 60s Batman series, sort of red phone rings, and it's Putin on the line, President. He's here to tell you what to do. It's not clear at all how every single one of Trump's actions could possibly have been directed by Putin simply on a practical level. How could it be done? He's surrounded by people. He's constantly in the public eye. How on earth could this back channel of communication existed? And yet, you would have believed from the media that he was constantly being controlled. Well,
people won Pulitzer Prizes on the basis of calling him a Russian spy. I mean, the American, I think that they had 5 or 10 articles a day in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I guess people still believe it. I think I saw somewhere that, 50% of the American population after the Iraq War thought that Saddam had nuclear weapons and he was a sponsor of Al-Qaeda, when in fact he hated Al-Qaeda. 50% of the population, and now 50% of, and these are the liberal elite professionals who ought to know better. I mean, they've got supposed to have high IQs and they've got big salaries, and they still think 7 years after the Mueller report that Trump is a Russian agent.
Well, clearly their salaries depend on it, as the famous phrase has it.
Exactly.
And indeed, as you say, whole careers are made, academic careers. I mean, there's a King's College London here in England, is stuffed full of people who effectively made their academic careers based on pretending to know what Putin thinks. They pretend to know Putin's psychology and understand his every whim and motivation, and publish papers and articles about this. And it's, as far as I can see, it's pure fantasy. Of course, it's very well paid for them, and it underpins a very dangerous and aggressive foreign policy on the part of the British, which appears to be leading the charge, if you like, to use a metaphor from the first Crimean War, charge a light brigade straight towards the Russian guns, quite frankly, in terms of the British determination to have war with Russia.
In a way, and Britain is kind of, the British intelligence community and academic community is dragging Britain in, and unprepared Britain is. So Britain is much better at intelligence operations than it is at purely military operations. So this is a completely militarily unprepared country which talks big words and makes fantastical claims, and then they're going to find that they're perfectly ill-equipped for a real war. But of course then plan B is to drag in the Americans using the pro-British newspapers in Washington and New York, and half of them are edited by Brits, incidentally, and they're true to their friends back in Fleet Street, in that they're very so I think that, was it Mark Thompson who ran the BBC, who was editor of the New York Times for a while, and Emma Tucker, who was a British journalist, she's editor of the Wall Street Journal. So I mean, if there were Russians at the head of newspapers in America, leading newspapers, people say, well, of course they're publishing pro-Russian propaganda and they're part of a network. But in fact, there is a foreign network inside Washington, New York, and it's British, So,
well, indeed, in the meantime, the British intelligence appears to be sort of run by Ukrainians at the moment. Or
That's right.
MI6 seems to be currently headed up by somebody with Ukrainian heritage.
That's right. I mean, that's funny because you're warning about the Russian intelligence operations, or Russian intelligence is infiltrating the West. But the Ukrainian intelligence, which originally was the KGB, has infiltrated the West, Incredible. Or the Russian talk about a lot of people in America still think Russia's communist. So they'll say that they'll make Russia, and they say communists are out to get us against or whatever. But it turns out we have got an ex-communist running Europe's foreign policy.
Yes. Kaya Kallas, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's and they're pointing. It's like that game. You point at someone else to avoid the fact to avoid the blame accurately be put on yourself. So all these East Europeans who were not Russian, admittedly, but who were part of the Soviet system, have infiltrated our politics with lies and deception and all the rest of it. Which often laid at the door of the Marxists or whatever. The Marxists are always infiltrating other countries, and so. But we have been infiltrated, and I think there might be I don't want to go into that necessarily. Might leave this out, but this blackmail allegations. Andrew Bridgen made a documentary thinking these Ukrainian rent boys. Yeah.
Well, I mean, clearly, depending on how wide you want to cast your net in viewing how far this infiltration has gone, and I have family in Canada, for example, in Edmonton, and in Edmonton there is a graveyard where there is a memorial to Ukrainian SS troops, and so in fact there were elements of the Ukrainian army fighting on the Nazi side who ended up in Canada, to the point that they have memorial stones in Canadian graveyards to this day. So, and of course we had only, was it 3 years ago perhaps, we had an occasion where the Ukrainian veteran of the Wehrmacht was applauded in the Canadian Parliament by the supposedly liberal Canadian government. So yes, I mean, there's a very strange inversion of if you like, the lessons that we were taught from the Second World War and so forth going on at the moment.
Yeah, let's try and just get back into the nitty-gritty of the day of the Skripals and then I want to talk through those anomalies that you found, like the blinking incident and so on. What's the official story of their last day, the day that they were poisoned?
Well, I mean, we've talked about how they touched a poison. Apparently they both touched poison from this door handle as they left the house. And as we mentioned, they had 3 or 4 hours during which time they had been poisoned, but they apparently were fine, to the point that they were able to enjoy a meal and a drink, as we said, feed ducks and so forth. And then they collapsed. And then they were taken to hospital, of course. So at the point they were taken to hospital, the ICU consultant who was at the hospital on duty at the point they were admitted was a gentleman called Stephen Cockcroft, Dr. Stephen Cockcroft. And he gave testimony 6 years later to the Dawn Sturgis inquiry about what had happened and how, how the Skripals had presented. Well, in point of fact, he didn't give information about how they were presented. It's a very interesting omission. The inquiry chose to ask a different doctor who wasn't present at the ICU about how the Skripals presented when they first arrived. it's very unclear why they would do such a thing. It's rather like not giving the pathologist the levels of drugs that were in Dawn's blood, a certain sort of confusion of information. Nevertheless, this second ICU doctor, who's called Dr. Haslam, said that they were very ill when they were admitted and they needed to be put on a ventilator and so forth and so forth. But the actual ICU consultant who was there did give evidence as well, and his testimony relates to something that happened 4 days after the Skripals were admitted. And so Dr. Haslam, who I mentioned before, was given exclusive control over Sergei and Yulia's care. And Dr. Cockcroft was given care for everybody else, if you like, in the ICU at that time. So the Skripals have been kind of separated off from the rest of the ICU, and Dr. Haslam was looking after them. And Dr. Cockcroft, although he had been the first to care for them when they arrived, had been sent to care for everybody else. So 4 days after their admission, Dr. Haslam apparently ordered what's called a sedation hold on Yulia. In other words, he asked for the amount of sedation that she was on to be reduced to see if she could return to consciousness, which is a common practice in ICU departments for patients who are, as it were, being held in a medically induced coma. You don't want to hold them in that state for any longer than is necessary, and so you wean them off these drugs slowly, and you'll see if they can regain consciousness, neurological function, and then obviously you hopefully want to quickly put them on a pathway to recovery, take them off the ventilation and so forth. So Dr. Haslam had ordered this for Yulia, we know this, and so Yulia's drugs were reduced. But then apparently Dr. Haslam left the ICU, he left the Salisbury Hospital ICU department while Dr. Cockcroft was still there in the background, and Yulia woke up. And because the ICU nurses couldn't locate Dr. Haslam, who should have been their primary doctor, they fetched Dr. Cockcroft, who was on the ICU ward, and said, "Come quickly." This is all testimony, by the way, that Dr. Cockcroft gives to the inquiry. "Quickly, Yulia's waking up. Come to Yulia's bedside." You know, great excitement and agitation and so forth. And so Dr. Cockcroft goes to Yulia's bedside, and he does discover her in a state of extreme anxiety, as you might expect. She has fully awoken from the sedation that she was being given, and she is trying to get out of bed. She's trying to remove the cannula and the lines that are in her arms. She's clearly still got a tube in her mouth, and she's trying to get out of bed. And so Dr. Cockcroft orders that Yulia's sedation should be returned, and she should be returned, but he tries to calm her down. He's extremely experienced. He's got 24 years experience as an ICU consultant at this point. Very credible witness. His testimony is exceptional testimony. And he says, you know, I wanted to calm her down. I wanted to settle her down. She's very anxious. He wanted to tell her, for example, that her father was in the next door ward and that it was okay, and calm down. And he apparently was used to communicating with his patients by asking them to blink yes or no as part of this interaction with patients who've been intubated, and so also they can't speak with their mouths. And it seems fairly clear that by this time, it was 4 days into the event, as I mentioned, by this time the hospital has been told by Porton Down that Sergei and Yulia Skripal have in fact, or so they've been told, been exposed to a deadly nerve agent, and not, as the hospital initially believed, exposed to an opiate overdose. That was the early diagnosis. So Dr. Cockcroft was operating under the impression or the understanding from Porton Down that his patients were, or Sergei and Yulia were, horribly injured by a nerve agent. That was his first assumption. And it also, it would seem, had been told by the police something about the movements of the Skripal during the time before they collapsed. So he had this information and he'd been thinking about it. How could a large old man like Sergei Skripal and a fit young woman like Yulia Skripal possibly have been overcome almost at the same time on this bench? They seemingly collapsed at almost the same point. And this is a problem for the doctors. They're confused about how this could have come about. Very unlikely that two people of such different sizes and weight would have passed out at the same time. So he's clearly been thinking about that, and he's considered the possibility for himself that they may have been sprayed, because this would explain the rapid onset of two different people becoming overcome. at the same time. So he's able to ask these questions of Yulia with this blink technique while the nurses are settling her down and returning her to unconsciousness and so forth, and asking her to blink yes or no to his questions. And he asks her a set of questions, and these questions are reproduced in the inquiry documentation. And so he says to Yulia, did you take something at home? And she says no, or blinks no. And he says, do you remember being sprayed? And she blinks yes. And then he says, do you remember being sprayed in the restaurant? Because as I said, he clearly knows something about their movements before they collapsed on the day. And she blinks yes. And as you've noted, we sort of leave this on a cliffhanger, because at the point when he asks her, do you know who sprayed you? She returns to unconsciousness, and you never find out. And it must be added, by the way, that Dr. Cockcroft was absolutely amazed that he was able to have this kind of interaction at all with Yulia. He fully expected her to be effectively brain dead. He was astonished that she was capable of this high-level neurological function of understanding and blinking and answering his questions. He fully expected her to effectively be, to all intents and purposes, dead, because he had been told by Porton Down. So we had this explosive, if you like, revelation that not only had Yulia not been injured to the point of brain death, as Dr. Cockcroft quite understandably had assumed, but she had recovered to the point that she really should have, at that point, I would suggest, medical protocol would mean she should be quickly moved towards complete rehabilitation. She should be taken off the ventilation, and she should be rehabilitated and, taken off the ICU
and
completely.
Interviewed, perhaps. Yeah.
Indeed. But what actually happened was she was returned to unconsciousness, as we know, and there's no suggestion at all that any further sedation holds or sedation reductions were practiced on her for 20 days. She was effectively held, if you like, under sedation, one might suggest, against her will for 20 days. Meanwhile, Dr. Cockcroft, who had discovered this extraordinary fact that Yulia was neurologically intact and was frankly perfectly well, so it would seem, was punished very badly by his superiors at Salisbury Hospital. The medical director of the hospital was called Dr. Christine Blanchard, and when she discovered this episode of Dr. Cockcroft having the blink interview with Yulia waking up and so on, she threatened him with a charge of professional misconduct and said if he did so much as mention this to any of his colleagues, and removed him from the ICU so he couldn't interact with any of the other people on the ICU, or the patients for that matter. And he was only allowed to return to the ICU once Sergei and Yulia had been discharged and were no longer, under the jurisdiction of the hospital. And within 6 months, he handed in his notice. He resigned. He'd had a 25-year career as extremely senior intensivist and consultant, but clearly he felt he couldn't stomach the way he'd been treated by the superior, and he resigned.
And this thing about Yulia being sedated, I mean, didn't the OPCW come and make interviews and ask questions? So she was sedated through a period through which they were to perhaps prevent outside inquiry from interviewing her. So basically kept away from questioning people by being unnecessarily sedated or put in a coma.
It's far darker than that, I'm afraid, far darker than that. Because the OPCW visited to take samples, as it were, to confirm the British diagnosis of Novichok poisoning. They wanted the, if you like, seal of independent approval or authentic independent verification, if you will, from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or the OPCW. So if you like, with some fanfare, the OPCW team came to Salisbury and they were given apparently samples taken from the door, though the chain of custody is not clear actually about the samples from the door, and they were given samples from Sergei and Yulia Skripal's blood. Once again, the chain of custody is not clear. The time at which these samples taken, for example, seems to have been missed off the records. But nevertheless, the exact same weekend that this team from the OPCW came to Salisbury, Sergei and Yulia had a tracheostomy put into their throats. They had a surgical hole made into their throats. They were no longer breathing through tubes to their mouths. they were breathing through a surgical tube that had been put through their throats. And this, if you like, was a physical, very literal impediment to them speaking. There was no way, if they even had wanted to and had been allowed to recover, no physical way they could have spoken to the OPCW. This procedure was done to them the precise weekend that the OPCW came to Salisbury, and certainly in the case of Yulia, it was wholly unnecessary. It was only in for 6 days in total. It was taken out 4 days after the OPCW left, and she in fact left hospital about 2 weeks after that. It's a thoroughly unnecessary procedure to have taken, certainly in Yulia's case, but nevertheless this happened, and it's very difficult not to conclude that it was done to prevent them from being able, literally prevent them from being able to speak.
Because apparently she managed to get to phone to call her cousin Victoria in Moscow, and the Russian intelligence had recorded that, kept it, and then released it to the media, at least the Russian media, and it showed that she said something like, "Oh, I'm safe, and so is my father, and nothing serious happened," or something like that, and she wasn't allowed to be talked to the British press about that very interesting revelation. I mean, that was the last time she spoke freely, and I think she made one very heavily written speech sitting in a garden somewhere, and she didn't answer questions. And some people said that, can't remember if it was in English or Russian. Was it in Russian? If it was in Russian, it had kind of telltale Anglicisms that suggested it had been written by an English speaker, then had it translated into Russian.
Yeah.
In other words, she hadn't written it herself.
That's right. I mean, people geolocated that famous speech to camera. It was falsely described as an interview, because as you rightly say, she didn't answer questions. It was not an interview. And it was done at RAF Fairford. In fact, that's where she was.
Right.
But yes, I mean, it was a very uncomfortable speech to camera that she made. I mean, one may add, in parenthesis, if you will, she was able to give a piece to camera quite safely, as it were, whereas 6 years later, when the Dawn Sturgis inquiry came around, the judge ruled it was too unsafe for her to give any kind of oral testimony, whereas clearly 6 years before, you might argue she was more at risk at that time, having, very shortly after the event, at risk of, once again, reprisals, but this didn't happen. And as you rightly say, that was the last time we ever saw her. And indeed, it was during her time in hospital that she made this call to Victoria. And it's interesting because, as you say, she does say, nothing's seriously wrong, Father, everyone can get better. But she also says, they won't give you a visa, because obviously Victoria is very keen at this point to visit, and come and see her in hospital. And Yulia says, one of the things she sort of says on the phone is, they won't give you a visa, and she's quite correct. Of course, Victoria wasn't given the visa, and she wasn't allowed to come and visit Yulia in hospital.
So this blinking, so it happened at the restaurant, and I was actually there. And I sat drinking a coffee, and they gave me my bill quickly. I don't know, maybe they have a stream of tourists who go there and drink coffee and take photographs of the ZZ sign and so on, Anyway, you said, I thought there's a famous photograph of her with her husband, her father, raising a glass, and then there's a photograph of a guy taking a photograph of the two of them, but he's reflected in the mirror. I thought it was Pablo Skripal, but you say it's not.
Pablo Miller, you mean?
Pablo Miller, it wasn't, okay. That was from another occasion. But if let's say they're being poisoned in the restaurant, and we don't know who poisoned them. If it was the two Russians, then there'd be CCTV of that, surely. So,
well, yes. I mean, the inquiry, very conveniently, there's various points at which there is no CCTV available, and one of those occasions is in the restaurant. So there's apparently no CCTV available of what was happening in. Certainly, as you know, since you went there recently, there certainly is CCTV in there now. It's all over the place in the restaurant, but apparently at the time there was no CCTV in the Italian restaurant where Yulia suggested in her Blink interview that she was sprayed. Likewise, there was no CCTV on Skripal's house, supposedly. This is another revelation to the Dawn Sturgis inquiry. Supposedly, it's very deeply improbable, but apparently in a written statement, Skripal said, and I'm sceptical that it was indeed Skripal writing this statement because it wasn't signed, so from a legal point of view it's questionable. Anyway, he said, I didn't want CCTV on my house as it would be too intrusive. So we're talking about CCTV pointing out of his house. We're not talking about CCTV monitoring the inside of his house, sending a feed back to GCHQ or anything of that nature. It's a very minimum level of security one might expect a retired spy, who apparently was quite wary and concerned about what was going on all the time. A minimum level of security would be for him to have CCTV on his house. However, we are told, or at least supposedly, the inquiry heard that he didn't have CCTV. And, you know, all these events, so the spraying of or the application of nerve agent to Skripal's door, there was apparently no CCTV of that. And then this period when this extraordinarily unlikely sequence of events where the two would-be Russian assassins take apart their bottle and seal it in plastic before dumping it. There's another 33-minute period, if you like, of CCTV black hole where all that's supposed to have occurred. Purely speculation on the part of the inquiry and the people involved.
So, if they went to a public toilet, there might have been a CCTV camera in the vicinity, and I actually walked up to the Skripal's house the other day, and I filmed it in the dark. It's about 10 in the evening, and incidentally, my phone's died the next day. You know, I had to reset the whole thing. Very strange. I have two phones. One was, and it happened to both of them. I mean, with one you can accept the fingerprint stopped working and the PIN number didn't work, but two at the same time, you know. So anyway, that's I was so there's no CCTV of anything that could actually prove their case, and lots of holes in the case. And Britain is, I said to my Dutch friends, is the most CCTV dense country in the world probably. But here we don't have them, and they said it could have been pointed out outwards. But there was CCTV outside the Shell petrol station, which is about a 10-minute walk from the property and a good 15 or 20-minute walk from the railway station, and kind of out of the way.
It's closer. It's actually close. You're right. It's 15 minutes from the station. It's actually about 300 metres as the crow flies from Skripal's house.
Right.
It's as close as we know they came to. And there is some CCTV of these two Russian gentlemen in Salisbury sometime after they apparently did the job. And one of the many curious anomalies in this narrative is the fact that after they apparently did this poisoning, they didn't try and leave Salisbury immediately. They didn't show any urgency about themselves at all. They in fact went window shopping in Salisbury, and there's a bit of footage from De Wolders, which is one of the shops in Salisbury. It's a stamp collecting shop, really, or a coins and rare stamp shop. And so they have CCTV of their own. It's interesting because this is, if you like, not CCTV that was supplied from official sources. It came from the shop itself. They did supply it to the police, obviously, but they also supplied it directly to the press. And in this footage, you can see them walking very casually. I mean, once again, this is supposed to be after they've done a terrible poisoning ordered by Vladimir Putin himself, if we're to believe the British narrative. And they just casually walk past the window, and one of them sees something interesting in the window, and they pause, and he pulls his elbow and says, "Look at this." And they try, and it's a Sunday, of course, so they can't get in, but they try and go into the shop. And it just shows a total lack of urgency to these two men. They missed the first train. They could have gotten a much earlier train. In fact, incredible though it may sound, the inquiry believes, through to other snips of TV they do have, that they actually went back to the Skripal house yet again to observe, as it were, their handiwork, and apparently from a distance watch as Sergei and Yulia leave the house, apparently to checking that they touched the nerve handle. It's really too improbable for words, but that is the official narrative. They went back, and then, having observed the Skripals apparently touch the poison, and the two Russians then return back to Salisbury railway station, where they have to wait for 40 minutes for the next train before they return back to London, and hence to Heathrow and back to Moscow that night.
But I mean, I wonder what they were doing though. Because I thought before, I didn't really look at the geography, but I walked around. I could see it, I could feel it for myself. But I mean, that road from the railway station to the Shell petrol station leads into a sort of non-central part of Salisbury, not very, very interesting, with car repair shops and warehouses and light factory warehouses, and not in a place that if they were tourists they would go. So they were doing something there. The question is just what, Well, I mean, there's a point, for example, shortly around the time they're seen on De Wolders CCTV, on the shop front CCTV,
That's about the same time, if we're to believe the timestamp. And by the way, the inquiry changes it, thinks it's a different time. They think the timestamp is wrong. But if the timestamp in De Walder's shop is correct, then at almost the same time, the Skripals are feeding the ducks, which we mentioned slightly before. They go feeding the ducks is one of the first things they do after they arrive in Salisbury. Having been poisoned, they've got poison on their hands. They feed ducks with bread. The ducks aren't killed, but Donald Trump is told that they are, and that leads to this international incident. But at that point, the two Russians and the Skripals are within 100 metres of each other, geographically speaking. So an explanation of why they're wandering around, possibly an alternative explanation, would be they are in fact seeking a rendezvous with Skripal, or possibly a dead drop of some kind of information, some kind of something to pick up or collect. Yes, I mean, it's mysterious. Clearly we don't know what happened. We know what didn't happen. And we know...
We don't know. Yeah, I mean, they might have been on the way... I don't know, yeah. Would you say then that is the blinking incident, that story, is that a smoking gun? Is that the strongest counter evidence, most convincing story that shows that the official story isn't correct?
I think it's whether or not you believe the Blink interview was correct. As I was saying, it certainly shows that Yulia was well. She was neurologically intact, to use, or very neurologically intact, to use Dr. Cockcroft's phrase. And so this places the onus very strongly on the hospital. You have to ask extremely difficult questions of the medical practice, or malpractice if you will, around Yulia's well-being at that point, because she should have been put on a pathway to swift recovery and a quick interview, instead of which she was held unconscious, during which time the whole, if you like, geopolitical and diplomatic maelstrom unfolded outside of the walls of Salisbury Hospital. Diplomats were expelled, and the Russians were accused. So, I mean, the inquiry itself suggested that Yulia's Blink interview should be dismissed because she was still coming round from the effects of sedative drugs. And furthermore, it said there wasn't strong enough traces of Novichok found in the restaurant, in Ziza's restaurant, for Yulia's account to be true. But clearly that makes several fairly large assumptions. For example, it seems from the first place that Novichok was genuinely what they were exposed to. And it rather sort of once again, it sort of retrofits the evidence to undermine the testimony of the witness giving the evidence, just as it did with Charlie Rowley's testimony about this plastic wrapping. It kind of fits the narrative around the evidence rather than allow the evidence to dictate the flow of the narrative. And just to mention quickly, having mentioned Rowley again, Yulia's Blink interview, her testimony was said to be unreliable because she was recovering from she was coming round from sedative drugs. Meanwhile, Charlie Rowley's account, which by his own admission was almost completely incoherent due to the influence of alcohol and heroin, is effectively accepted almost word for word, or in essence, as true by the British inquiry. So there's a strange juxtaposition there, where they're willing to accept a very unreliable testimony, drug affected, but they're not willing to accept any of the testimony of Yulia herself as she came round from drugs.
And we'll just say that the OPCW turned up. Oh, they were given a very pure sample of Novichok provided by Porton Down, which suggests that if it had been from the doorknob, where it would have been degraded by rain and weather, it would have been showed impurities. But they got a pristine example. And the other thing is that because the British always said that the Novichok can only be manufactured by the Russians, but some experts have said it can be manufactured by anyone with competence. And of course, Porton Down is one of the most competent agencies in the world. And they provided a pure sample to the OPCW, suggesting that maybe it wasn't that, but something that they'd confected and put together and given the OPCW. That's
right. I mean, this question of purity is interesting. And some people might think that it does. The British angle would be to say the purity suggests there's clearly a state actor involved. But this seems to me, that doesn't follow to my mind in the slightest. And in fact, there's a professor of organic chemistry called David Collum, who is the Professor of Organic Chemistry at Cornell University, so one of the absolute leading research universities in the world in America. And as we mentioned earlier, the formula for Novichok, or certainly one formula for Novichok, had been published in 2008 in a book. So it was available. And in the aftermath of this Novichok event, he decided to set his first year chemistry students a test to see if they could make it. So theoretically make it, not actually make it in the laboratory, but could synthesize it on paper. In other words, would know how to do it. And he said it there in an exam question. He said, this is the formula for Novichok. Please, can you synthesize it for your exam question? And he said, well, every single kid in his organic chemistry class, apart from one, got it all completely right. One kid dropped a few points, but apart from that, all the kids in his chemistry class were all able to synthesize Novichok. So then it's really just a question of who has the capacity to make it safely, because obviously synthesizing a chemical in theory and actually manufacturing it in practice would require very secure, safe fume cupboards and so forth. But it's not as if Porton Down, or indeed, well, of course Porton Down would have those facilities, extensive facilities of that nature, but many, many chemical laboratories would have these kind of facilities to handle dangerous chemicals. And so the idea that only Russia could have manufactured this chemical is really quite risible. And just to add to that, VX, which up until Novichok was the most deadly nerve agent known to man, and I suggest probably is still the most deadly nerve agent known to man since Novichok in practice, doesn't seem to be very deadly, was developed in Porton Down in the 1950s. So you might say it's a nerve agent of a type developed by Britain. So to follow the logic of this, well then all VX attacks clearly then must have been carried out by the British. That's the logic that we're expected to follow when it comes to Novichok being a Russian weapon.
It's so ridiculous, this propaganda. As soon as someone says something about Putin, they'll put a Russian hat on him and the backdrop of the Kremlin or the St. Basil's, and they'll turn the R's back the other side round and Russian lettering, or they'll say Novichok, they'll invent something Russian, and we're off to the races. It's incredible. They do it every time. They've been doing it for centuries.
Yeah.
But so do you have a theory? They were poisoned by something that wasn't as let's exclude the Novichok possibility, and possibly they're poisoned by their own side. Do you have any? I'm far less versed than you are, but I remember somebody said something. It could be a substance called BZ or something. But have you looked into this at all? What could be the alternatives chemicals?
Yes. So there's a Swiss laboratory, and I've been mispronouncing its name. It's spelled Spies, but I think the Swiss would pronounce it Spice.
Right.
Anyway, it's an extremely advanced laboratory in Switzerland, and it's an OPCW verified laboratory. In other words, there's only 33 in the world verified laboratories that are able to take samples from the OPCW and carry out this kind of analysis that we've been talking about. And they were one of the laboratories that received the blood samples from Sergei and Yulia Skripal at the time. And this was done in secret because, of course, the OPCW operates a sort of double-blind system whereby it would secretly give two of its laboratories splits of the same samples, ask them both to do the same analysis. Then it would secretly get the results back, and it would compare the results. And if the results tally, then they would have a double-blind result. And indeed, in this case, they actually had 4 laboratories. They had 2 testing the environmental samples and 2 testing the blood samples, if you like, the biological samples. So you might even call it a quadruple blind system the OPCW were carrying out. But one of these laboratories, as I say, was a Swiss laboratory. And in a sort of totally unprecedented development, Sergei Lavrov, obviously the Russian foreign minister, revealed that they effectively had a spy in this Swiss laboratory, and they knew what the results were from the tests on the Skripal's blood. And the Russians claimed that one of the substances that had been identified in their blood was this substance called BZ. And BZ is a non-lethal nerve agent, if you like. It's an fast-acting incapacitant, you might say. It's a kind of form of super powerful LSD, a very powerful hallucinogen. And so the Russian side claimed that indeed this had been found in the Skripal's blood, and in fact the OPCW did not deny that. They said, they claimed afterwards that this substance, BZ, had been added to the Skripal sample as a kind of control substance to see if the OPCW labs could identify all the chemicals, and if they all identified certain chemicals, they'd all need to identify BZ as the controlled substance. It's rather improbable explanation, but furthermore, a little bit like the way that fentanyl was found in Dawn's blood. Because fentanyl was given, according to the hospital, to Dawn after her admission to hospital, there was no way of knowing if she could have actually taken fentanyl before her admission to hospital. So similarly in this case, with the OPCW saying that BZ had been put into the blood samples as a controlled substance, there was then no way of telling if indeed there was a possibility that the Skripals had in fact been exposed to this non-lethal hallucinogen.
But and of course, I think the reason why they're doubling down is that if all this comes out, they'll lose everything. They're playing a very high stakes game. I think Trump knows everything that we've just spoken about. Putin has told him, and I think, for instance, he's putting enormous pressure on the British to go along with a peace deal with the Ukrainians, and I think he's armed with all the information about Russiagate and so on. He knows, and he knows that they might be planning another false flag, because this might not be the last time the British try to seize control of the narrative. I mean, they might say, okay, we're not going to go to war, but if Putin tries it one more time, then we're at war with Russia. 2 weeks later, a poisoning attack in, I don't know, Winchester or Brighton or something, and that's it, right, we're going to war. And that's what worries me.
I share your concerns, very much so. I think there's nothing more dangerous, in fact, than the sort of cornered British establishment, as it were, facing, if you like, a strategic defeat in Ukraine, or rather its allies' defeat. So at that point, the danger of some sort of false flag attack rises to a very sort of high level. It's terribly concerning. Yes.
So I mean, not only are because the Ukrainians could turn, the Ukrainians might say, you've led us down the garden path. We've sacrificed 2 million men, half our country, half our male population has left the country, our prosperity, and all because you were using us as a battering ram. You didn't really care about us, and you told lies, and we're screwed because we were short of all your support. Boris Johnson turned up after Istanbul. So they might turn against it. They'll tell everyone who can listen in the world of geopolitics, don't ever make friends with the British.
I think that's right. And I mean, there's various, apparently Keir Starmer was entered into a sort of 100-year deal with Ukraine. There's various schools of thought that there are sort of, backroom deals to do with rare earths and other economic benefits relating to the British support for Ukraine, and the huge amount of money that's been sort of sunk into this project, Ukraine.
Anything that could serve as sort of, the last words of the documentary type thing,
Well, I mean, I feel the Skripal case is a wonderfully weak narrative from the point of view of the British elites. It's terribly shaky on so many levels, and it's because of that it's become such an interest of mine, and why I think it's a sort of weak point, something you could hammer at to the point where you could sort of break the ice, as it were, that's sort of set over the relations between Europe and Russia, and indeed America. That's what I hope for it. I really do hope that if there comes a general realisation that we are being lied to, and it's once you make that simple leap of kind of realisation that governments quite happily lie to their populations for geopolitical objectives, and it wasn't that long ago that we were lied to about the WMD in Iraq to lead to a catastrophic attack in the Middle East. And let's not forget that Novichok supposedly is indeed a WMD. Saddam wasn't supposed to have nuclear weapons so much as chemical weapons that he was capable of firing within 45 minutes.
Right.
So once again, it would appear, or I suggest it is a possibility, that the British establishment have been lying about the existence of WMD, not as it was in 2003 in Iraq, but indeed, as it were, coming from Russia.
And hugely more damaging because Russia has nuclear weapons as powerful. So you can be selfish and say, well, Iraq's not that important anyway, they can do us that much harm, but it caused huge ructions. Both of us lived through it, you know, and remember all the demonstrations and the media coverage and the mea culpas afterwards. Fucking, a few years later, the British are doing the same thing again. But of course, you can be a patriot. I think I'm a patriot. You're a patriot. To be criticised the British government is not the same thing as being anti-British. You're being pro-British. It's our leaders that are doing bad things, and they have to be held to account.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the patriotic duty of everyone who believes themselves to be living in a democracy, and that's another question, but whether or not you believe yourself to be living in a democracy, it's your patriotic duty to ask questions of the government and to be sceptical of power. This is the minimum. This is what the media ought to be doing. That's what the Fourth Estate ought to be doing. That's what they've failed to do consistently now for decades. So citizens have to do it for themselves. You have to be sceptical yourself. You have to be sceptical of what you read in the papers or the newspapers or online websites, official sources, and you have to be sceptical of the government. And, you know, we may agree, oh yeah, well, of course, Russia has nuclear weapons and as such is a far more significant threat to us in real terms than Iraq. But 1 million people were killed in Iraq on the basis of a lie. We cannot step away from the moral weight of what was done on the basis of these lies or avoid the gravity of what is done on the back of absolute concocted dossiers, as once again we have in the case of the WMD lies. So let's not be under any illusion that the British intelligence is not willing to carry out the most terrible, terrible things. The death of Dawn Sturgis is one death, and it's a tragic death, you know, and it may have been weaponised to this narrative and used to bolster this narrative. But millions, literally 1 million Iraqi people were killed on the basis of British lies.
شو اسمك عمو؟ انت وين ابوك؟ وين مات؟ شنو متريقة متغدية متعشية؟